Okay. So guidelines on how to build a new regression suite and specifically how BDT can help over there. How to set up test suites, manual or automatic. Yes, we will definitely be talking about that, though not specifically about different types of test suites, but we'll be talking about a specific type of test suite, how we can build and make it effective. That's to Sam's question. We'll wait for 2 more minutes and then we'll start off. Go to meeting at times can be a pain installing the client if the specific one is not there. Nidhi has asked a great question. A regression test suite tends to grow exponentially as new functionality is introduced. I would like to hear ideas on how to keep it more focused and concise. And Nidhi, this is exactly the problem BDT tries to solve. It gives you a way to approach this in a more structured fashion without losing value of testing, but make sure regression suite is still concise and as required only. There's another question I would like to know, given a web app, how do you choose what to automate? How do you handle flaky tests? This will be covered in some parts, but how do you handle the flaky tests? Specifically, that portion, that is a separate discussion, which I do not plan to talk about in this session. But based on the content of the session and the other questions and follow ups that happen, feel free to reach out to me separately and then we can talk about that. And I can give you some thoughts about how to approach the flaky test problem. I will be sharing my contact information also. Okay, so yep, one more question came in, when to use BDT and when not. Great question. We will be talking about that. And I think that's sufficient time. Maybe we can get started off. Mona, is that okay?
Yes, Anand, we should start.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Anand Bagmar. We are going to talk today about how to build a right regression suite using behavior driven testing. Note that right is mentioned in quotes, and it is for a very good reason it is mentioned in quotes. There is no one right behavior. It all depends on the context of the product under test and what is required to be done. Various other parameters that we will be speaking about later in the session, which all combined defines what right really means. A quick introduction about myself. I'm Anand Bagmar. I've been in the testing industry for about 17 plus years now, and I've done all different forms of testing, right from support, black box testing, manual performance testing, white box testing, building test frameworks. So whatever really comes my way, anything that is related to testing, I'm very passionate about getting involved in that. I also do open source tools related with testing. I've had a good few ideas over this time period, and I've actually got opportunity to implement those. I've been with my current job is I'm at ThoughtWorks. I'm the ThoughtWorks test practice lead, and along with that, I also do consulting, coaching, trainings, speaking at conferences. Enough said about myself. I've mentioned my email addresses and my Twitter hashtag. My about me pages has more contact information for me. So feel free to reach out to me with comments, feedback, questions beyond this session. Looking forward to connect with you all. That said, let's get to the crux of the topic. Before we do that, I would like to start off with a few concepts. Uh, the first one being the test pyramid. I'm hoping all of us have heard about the test pyramid, what it really means. But for those who have not, a very quick recap about it. The test pyramid was introduced by Mike Cohn in his book Succeeding with Agile, and it was later on very well explained by Martin Fowler on his blog. This is not a new concept, but unfortunately, it is a concept that is not really implemented very well or understood very well by the teams. We understand it at a very high level view, but when it comes to implementing it, we get lost for various different factors. What the test pyramid says is there's an ideal test pyramid which has got various different categories or types of tests, and it could be functional, web service, integration, component, unit tests, and all these different types of tests really depend on what is the product under test. If there is a UI component, then there will be functional tests of sort. If there is a web service layer, then there might be web service test that is possible. Depending on how complex the product architecture is, there could be integration tests with different systems and component tests, and of course, the unit tests that are there. This is all automation. Testing cannot be complete by just automation. There is a very big emphasis on the manual or exploratory testing, which is very much essential in any testing effort, combined testing effort, to ensure that the product that is going out is truly of good quality. What the test pyramid doesn't really show well, which I've tried to capture in this uh, image, is the test pyramid is sitting like a pyramid, but there is an inverted pyramid, more like an ice cream cone of sorts, which is the actual product under test. So if you look at it, the unit tests, which are at the bottom layer of the test pyramid, they cover the most granular and individual bits of functionality of implementation of the product under test. As you go above in the layers of the pyramid, what you see is the impact of the product of your test on the product keeps on increasing. So, as you go up to the functional test on the top, it is impacting the widest range of the product under test. What this means is the cost, the effort, the time keeps going up or increasing for each of these types of tests as you move from bottom of the test automation pyramid to the top of the pyramid. Time increases because unit tests It can run on developer machines and you can get feedback within seconds. Component tests might be a few seconds. Integration tests might need a product to be compiled or certain components to be built and integrated in a certain way for you to be able to run integration tests against that. For web service tests, you actually need a product or the web services at least to be deployed in a particular fashion to enable testing of those web services. For the functional test, you need the complete product to be deployed in a particular in some environments to be able to do certain tests around it. So the cost involved in getting these environments up, the effort required to get it up, and of course the time required for the test to execute keeps on going up as you go from bottom of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid. What this means is the more effort you put on top layer of the pyramid, the feedback to the developers, to the team is getting delayed more and more. The other aspect of the test automation pyramid is certain parts, the unit test, component test, integration test, for example. These are technology facing tests. These are more of the implementation side of it to make sure that whatever functionality has been built in from a technical perspective, is it working well? Have I built my sufficient test coverage to say if the functionality is not going to break as we go on? The top layer, the web services and the functional tests, including the exploratory tests, they are more business facing tests. They are more in terms of what is a business requirement, what is a user requirement, how is the user going to be working with this functionality or set of functionalities to ensure that the product is doing what it's supposed to do. If you take, if you really think about it, if you take a deep look, you'll find out there are different patterns of implementation of this test pyramid on teams. So one of the realities is on teams you will find two different types of test pyramids. One is the test pyramid that the development team owns. The other is the test pyramid that the QA team or the testing team owns. And there is a big divide in it. Now this is in the because of maybe the way the organization is structured, the way the teams are structured, and the silos being created between devs and QAs or devs and testers. But as a result, what happens is developers are building their own set of testing, test automation in form of unit tests, component tests, or integration tests. And the QA team is building their own form of tests. It could be web service tests, functional tests, various types of functional tests. But they are not really talking to each other. As a result, what happens is there could be a lot of gaps in the automation test coverage between devs and testers, or there could be a lot of duplication also because the teams have just not spoken to each other about it. So that is one form of reality where in teams there are two test pyramids that exist and that is creating duplication or gaps in the automation testing effort. The second reality is an anti-pattern also is if we have this product under test, which we saw in the earlier few screens, and the test pyramid is also inverted in this case. What this really means is there is hardly any unit test coverage, or the devs have hardly written any tests on the implementation side of it, and the team is realizing or putting in more and more focus on the web service or the functional tests, which means that your functional test suite is bloated. The feedback is not coming in very quickly or very efficiently to the team, devs as well as testers, BAs, product owners, everyone. And as a result, the test suite is so bloated, it may not even give the correct results. As a result, in spite of putting in all these efforts on automation, there is a huge effort required of manual and exploratory testing before any feature goes live, before any functionality goes live. And these two patterns that we've seen and anti patterns, the two pyramids and the ice cream cone effect, they are very much a reality in a lot of organizations that I have worked with. That said, let's move on to the next concept about BDD and BDT. BDD is again not new. It was introduced by Dan North, I believe, in somewhere around 2008. Hi, was there a question? Okay. Thought I heard someone asking something. Okay, so BDD is not a new concept for that matter, but let's quickly look at what does it mean. In BDD, you look at it's a technique where you look at the functionality or the feature or the requirement out of the box, and a different set of collaborators or all the different collaborators, devs, QAs, test BAs, product owners, everyone come together and collaborate based on what that requirement really is by thinking out of the box, and they come up with a set of specifications. These specifications are also called acceptance criteria in various different forms. The developers then take these specifications in form of acceptance criteria, and then they use their TDD, test driven development practices. They write a failing test for that, right? Implement the code to make the test pass, and this cycle continues. And in the process, they continuously keep on refactoring the product code base to ensure that all the tests are always passing, and they are actually building writing code exactly for the specification that is required. This can in a way also be termed as acceptance test driven development. If you take these acceptance criteria and convert that into executable code, but that's a development practice. It is often mistaken by the testing team to say that no, I'm doing BDD. Are you really doing BDD? Because if you're doing BDD, then you would take the acceptance criteria, define various different types of acceptance criteria, positive, negative, edge case scenarios of sort, and then you would implement the code only based on those acceptance criteria. But are you really doing that? What typically happens in most organizations is testing happens in parallel, of course. The acceptance criteria and everything is defined together, but the kind of testing that testers do is after development is done in incremental pieces. So developers would have developed, taken acceptance criteria, broken it down into various test driven development based tests, implemented the functionality, and then the testers on the dev machines itself would try out various different scenarios to ensure more scenarios are covered. So BDD is really a development practice. But when it comes to the testing side of it, we can really understand and learn from this concept and see how it can make our testing efforts better. And that is where I've started calling it behavior driven testing. This is a technique, it's just a way of thinking of how testing should be done. It is just defining a particular approach of looking at the big picture to enable you to do testing in a more structured fashion. This is not a framework in any form, this is not a formal process, and we'll see exactly how it can be applied. It is very important to focus on the big picture because what typically happens is, as testers, we get so caught up in doing our daily testing activities, testing individual stories, or if you're working in Agile, or testing individual bits of functionalities and requirements and various different forms of test cases that we've come up with, we lose sight of the big picture. The big picture is very essential to keep in mind. We need to keep thinking about how is this functionality going to be used by the end user, what is going to be their thought process when using the product, and what is the core business value I'm delivering to
Sorry,
the end
Anand, to
user.
interrupt you.
If we do not think about the big picture, we get lost in the silos, we get stuck at the fine grained granular levels, and we may end up validating a requirement which was not even existing or usable in that fashion. So it is very important to keep looking at the
Anand,
big
can I
picture.
interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Yes. So whosoever is on the phone, can you please mute yourself? There has been a continuous disturbance. Can someone on this phone please mute themselves? I'm not able to mute them from my go-to client. So can you mute yourself? Okay, thank
Okay. Okay. Hopefully that is better. Thanks, Mona. So, how are we going to achieve looking at this big picture and do effective testing as our regression suite? We saw this ideal test pyramid image earlier. We saw that the lower level is the technology facing test. Our focus in this session is to identify the right type of tests that sit on top of the test pyramid, which includes a manual exploratory testing, functional testing, web service testing. Wherever you get a completely deployed product or a good chunk of the product deployed, how can you validate that you're doing the right form of testing at that top layer? We'll be talking about some words of caution about when this is going to be effective or not later. But I just want to bring your attention to the fact that our focus in this session is to identify the top layer of the pyramid and not about anything else. Okay. The third concept is about the test specification styles. Now, if our focus is to identify the right type of business facing tests, there are two ways you can identify these tests. One is, or you can specify these tests. One is the imperative style, the other is a declarative style. And let's take an example to explain what this means. So let's say for some awesome airlines website that you are working on, it could be a web app, it could be a mobile app, anything for that matter, or a combination. If the functionality that is being implemented right now is to allow a guest user to search for a flight for a single traveler and the ability to specify contact information for person booking the flight, very limited functionality because this is still in the works. The site is coming up right now. So if this is the functionality that we want to do, what we are going to do is we are going to search. Based on the search results, select something and then provide the contact information. If this is the flow of the product functionality right now, in the imperative style, you could write it as, and sorry, I jumped too ahead. For this example, I am using a BDD way of specifying the test. BDT is not about what how you specify the test, whether it's in a BDD type tool or BDD tool or some other tool. Just in case of this example, we are using a BDD tool to demonstrate the point better. So in the imperative style of writing the test, we could say given I am a guest user on the home page and I select round trip option, select Chicago from origin drop down, select San Francisco from destination, and keep on specifying the various different things required to enter the search criteria. After clicking on search, I see the search results page and select first option from there. And then I go to the contact information and I continue doing whatever else is required based on the functionality. So you see, it has taken me two PowerPoint screens and that too with a lot of dots in between to specify what is the search criteria, what am I searching for, what do I do with the search results, and what do I do with the contact functionality. This is typically what a functional test would be like, right? It's not just about enter search details. That's not a sufficient test from a functional perspective. So the test specification has become quite long, and that too for a product that is not yet completely usable also for that matter. So imperative way is very cumbersome in that sense. There's another way of specifying the same test, and that is a declarative style. In this, I would say, for example, given I'm a guest user, when I search for flight options for a one way trip for one adult from Chicago to San Francisco, and I select the first flight and I enter valid contact details for traveler one, then I'm able to save and continue. Now, this has become so much more precise. And as the product starts getting mature in a certain way, and mature, I'm saying right from coming up with your first vanilla page for the site to actually getting some functionality implemented, the imperatives you would typically start off from the imperative style, but you need to move to a declarative style because first of all it is going to be concise. Second, you start talking the domain language and you're hiding the implementation details of saying whether I'm choosing a certain thing from the UI or I'm selecting a certain thing from a drop down or whatever the UI element specific actions are happening. I don't need to worry about that from a functional testing perspective. From a functional testing perspective, if you keep that pyramid in mind, we are talking about the breadth of the product that we need to cover in the minimal number of tests so that we can achieve that functionality, validate the functionality. Okay. I'll wait for a minute over here to see if there are any questions so far before we proceed on the next thing. Do we have any questions so far? No? Okay, so these are just concepts that we spoke about. And now let's get into the crux of the webinar to see how what really BDT is and how can it solve the problem of having a good robust regression suite which will help the team. I want you all to think about a particular scenario that you can relate with. And this is important because everyone, based on your experiences, will come across different scenarios. And it is, I don't want to come down to talk about a specific case study which you may not be able to relate to. So think about the following thing. Think about a project or multiple projects which have been long running that you've been part of or you know about. These projects may be involving integrating with or working with legacy applications as well. And because these are long running projects and these are complex products for that matter, they're integrated with different systems. The simplest of the system might be a payment gateway, for example. I want to interact with a payment gateway to book my ticket for whatever form, right? So think about some such project that you have been part of or you know of. What are the typical functional testing challenges that come up in such cases that you have observed or you've heard about? Things that come to my mind could be on such projects there is limited automation and automation of various different types, right? Now, all the different layers of the test pyramid. Because it's a complex product, the regression cycle is long. And because the regression cycle is long, there is limited automation. There's a huge cost of fixing defects. Why huge cost? Because by the time you find the defect, could be pretty late in the cycle. By the time that defect is reported and the developers pick it up, do analysis on it, the context has been lost when those changes were actually made in the product. So there's a lot of context switching that needs to happen, and it essentially increases the cost of fixing that defect. But because of these challenges, what happens is there is no real visibility into what is being tested. The test itself might be outdated. The functional automation could be very brittle because you are now looking at the UI layer for a complex product which has got a very weird kind of test suite. As a result, the automation offers less or little value for the team. They are expensive to build and execute. And as a result, it's a maintenance nightmare also because you've got now so many tests which are not giving as much value and they keep on failing every now and then. They could be flaky for whatever reasons. To me, this results in a huge set of problems. One is the team starts losing trust on each other. Devs lose trust on the testers lose trust from the developers. You did not build a good product code itself. Automation, people start losing hope from. Manual testing, how much can you really cover in manual testing over and over again, especially if it's a complex product? If you have thousands of test cases, will you really be executing those thousands of test cases manually every time a defect has been fixed or a set of defects is fixed or a new functionality has been developed? Not really. But as a result, what happens is we get into the finger pointing and a blame game. Can you all relate with this problem? Okay. So that said, I'll quickly explain my specific case study and how I solved the problem. So in my case, I was working on a real time used vehicle auction product. There was just one web page, or rather two web pages. One was for the admin part to set up the auction. The second was the actual auction page. And it's a pretty complex page for that matter. There's a lot of information over here where you have the sales statistics, the details of the vehicle, and the bid histories, the bid increments around it. And the same page is seen by auctioneer, different sellers, and hundreds of buyers who are part of that same auction in real time. Based on the role and the permission settings for each of these connected participants, the page would be rendered in different fashion. So there's a lot of complex JavaScript and backend logic to this, how to make the same page render uh, with same look and feel, but different information to all these people. Now, from a functional testing perspective, how do you test a complex concurrently used application in real time and provide a good test coverage around this? Okay. The data setup over here is also a huge problem. Data setup, I'm guessing, is a problem in most of the projects that we work on, unless it's greenfield projects where you're really working in tight collaboration with the developers, which enables us to create hooks in the system to create the data much more better. Anyway, if this was my problem statement, that I have got, let's say, 100 buyers, 5 sellers, and one auctioneer connected to the sale to the auction at the same time, and each vehicle is being sold or process or not sold in less than 30 seconds, and there's a lot of aggressive bidding that is happening, and no two buyers can bid for the same amount. If one buyer bids for 4,000, the next has to bid at the next incremental amount, that is 4,200. So how do you handle concurrency issues in form of testing, in form of test automation more precisely? It was a very complex problem to solve. So I thought about various different ways how to approach the problem. And for sure, I did not want to be so disconnected or so far away from the actual testing to know what is going on. At the same time, for my management team also, I didn't want them to be so distant so that they needed to ask me or someone else at every time what is being tested, what is the quality of the product. I do not want a 10,000-foot view for this. I want to know exactly what is going on so that I can know the health of my system in real time every time. So I came up with an idea. I thought if I can remove the ambiguity in the testing and provide the same common visibility for everyone, my problem will be solved. Because if everyone knows about what is being tested, everyone knows about the health of the system in a common, uniform way, then there is no trust deficit. There is no finger pointing. Everyone knows at the moment when the problems happen or when things are working well for that matter. So that was my brilliant idea, to say I want to remove the ambiguity and I want to provide the same visibility. Now, to achieve these goals was a huge challenge. It required a completely different way of working. This was my case study, this was my idea. Now, a quick recap. Our focus of this session is to identify the top layer of the pyramid, the business facing tests, and how can these become the good regression test candidates for us. So, to achieve the problem that we stated, we had to fit in all pieces of the puzzle together. We had to collaborate with all different roles and say this is a team problem that we are trying to solve, a solution for the team that we are trying to build. We want everyone to come in together, and we want to identify what is the right type of test that we want to do, what is the value we are providing with these set of functionalities to the end user. So we found out the most expensive tool in the market. We got all the product owners together, all the BAs together, all the developers together, all the testers together. And by all, I really mean it's not getting tens of people or 20, 30 people or hundreds of people together. It's getting representations from each of the role, the SMEs of each different role, getting them together to work with the most expensive tool that we had in a room, which was a whiteboard and marker pens. We sat down and we mapped out different functionalities, what the product owners, what the business expected out of this product. We started off by saying, okay, what are the different functionalities we are trying to achieve? What are the different personas who can achieve these functionalities? And we created this mind map on a drawing board to take it from a starting point to the end or the intermediate but valid functionality in the system, and we drew it out. Initially, everyone started thinking about the UI flow, how this would happen. Oh, I click on this and then certain things would happen, and I select this thing from the drop down and then certain things happen. We went with that flow. And then we said, okay, fine, we need to go a layer above. We don't want to talk about UI functionality, we want to talk about business functionality. What is the business functionality in increments, in rules of sort, that need to be applied to go from the starting point of this diagram till the end state, which is acceptable. The end state might be something that a vehicle is sold. The end state might be something that I have saved this particular state in a draft mode and I'll come back to it later. That is also acceptable end state. So we drew this out. Based on all this mapping that we came about, this essentially becomes a flowchart or a state diagram of sorts. And there could be loops in this also, right? That if I have to do certain validation, if validation fails, retry it for a couple of times till you succeed, only then you can proceed ahead. So from the state diagram, what we did is for each unique path from the left side till the end functionality, we created test scenarios for these, or what I call as user journeys. For a particular user, how do you go from starting point till the end point? Once we created a list of all these user journeys, we then did a cost value analysis on them. Cost is in terms of actual cost of implementation, the type of tools that might be required, the time it would require to implement the test, and more importantly, what is the value of implementing these tests or executing these tests. And value could be in terms of risk to the business, a monetary cost, or change in functionality that has happened based on past experiences of the product where we've seen, oh, the payment gateway interface is always flaky. I want to make sure I test it every time. That becomes high value in adding that test, right? So we did the cost value analysis and we said the first candidate of those tests is high value and low cost. I want to definitely try and automate these because this is most likely going to be in my 80-20 rule. The second candidate for automation is going to be something that is high value, but it still has high cost. But because the value is high, I'm willing to absorb the high cost because it is going to be very beneficial for me to automate these. The third one, low value, low cost. Yeah, if I've got a lot of time, I will automate it. Else, this for sure is my manual regression. The fourth one, it is high cost to implement, but it has low value. I definitely do not want to automate these because it just does not make sense. This definitely remains my manual regression. Now, using this criteria, we came up with, we classified our tests in terms of what is it that we want to do for these tests. Now, remember over here, we are talking about business functionality. We are talking about after a particular functionality has been tested. So if, for example, I'm changing a drop down to a radio button for whatever reason, I want to do whatever positive, negative, manual and exploratory testing around it to as much detail as possible. But what we are talking about now is after that testing is done, I've validated the functionality, that specific functionality is working well. What do I add in my regression suite? If I've tried out 100 different things in that one particular page that has changed, I do not want to repeat those 100 things in form of my regression the next release, or the next iteration if you're working agile, or the next sprint if I'm working scrum, those form of things, right? So detailed testing is happening as a functionality is being built and developed and built. But what do you add to your regression suite? This is the framework, or this is a technique that has helped me tremendously. After all that testing, we created mind maps. We identified the user journeys which are of high value. Based on the user journeys, we did a cost value analysis. From the cost value analysis, we said, okay, we know now what we need to automate or not. Another point to note over here, I'm just going to go back a slide, is if this is my mind map, and let's say the next feature addition, I need to add a couple of boxes in between and change a few flows based on those boxes that have been added. Maybe new rules have been added in that particular flow. Those changed mind map should result in a mapping of similar type of user journeys and say, I already had this user journey, but I need to update it in order to make it in tune with what my product functionality is now. It doesn't mean I have to add new user journeys for every new rule that is added in the system or new business functionality that is added in the system. We constantly keep on updating the user journeys and deleting user journeys because certain things might not be applicable anymore. And only then, if we think we still need to add something else, then we would go ahead and add the new user journeys and do the cost value analysis on them again, following which we can choose to automate it if we have the bandwidth to do that. Questions so far? No? I'll keep proceeding. If there are any questions, please feel free to please add them in the chat room, and I'll get to it. Now, we've identified the tests. One part of the problem is done. Usually, the challenge is, and this was one of the questions asked initially before we began the session also, is how can we keep the test suite really manageable? The biggest problem is to identify what is the type of test that we should automate or we need to regress for that matter. With this technique, we have tested everything. I do not need to document hundreds of tests. I should execute them based on what my gut feel is, based on what my experience and expertise in the domain is, based on my past experiences for that matter. And I should test it out thoroughly. I should explore the system, beat it to death for various different reasons, and make sure it is working well based on what changes have happened. But from those hundreds of tests, if you map it using mind maps or any other tool and do a cost value analysis in terms of the user journeys, your biggest problem is solved. You have now reduced those hundreds of test cases to a good few test scenarios or user journeys, which become part of your regression tests. And then, if you can automate it, that is icing on the cake, or cherry, and with a cherry on top of it. Because now, with by automating it, what you have done is you've closed the loop. You have thoroughly tested your application. You have identified the right form of regression tests, and you have made sure that with that being automated, any time those tests are executed again, they will tell you exactly what is required to be told about the health of the product. It will capture any business related regression issues that you might have. Remember, automate tests that are valuable, not because you can or like to automate. This is one of the analysis paralysis kind of loophole we get into as automation testers. We love automation. We will automate each and every test that is possible. But a result of that becomes a bloated test suite, a brittle test suite, a test suite which is taking a long time to provide the feedback. And as a result, it's not going to be valuable. So find out what is important to be automated and automate only that. Getting back to our case study. So if you remember our auction page that we had, so one of the scenario that we had in the auction, this is what we came up with. We chose to, we had two options in case of the auction. We could write a user flows based on the personas and how they use the business functionality. So for example, an auctioneer, how is an auctioneer going to use that auction functionality? Or write the business flows and how different personas can use that. So if my business functionality is to sell a vehicle to the highest bidder, what needs to happen in terms of the auction setup and the bidding to ensure that the highest bidder is going to win that vehicle, is going to own the vehicle. So there are different approaches to it. In the auction context, the latter, writing the business flows and how different user personas can use it, that worked well for us. You have to see what is your product under test, and based on that, you can choose any approach to create those mind maps and the user journeys. But once we had this thought process clear in our mind, this is what we came up with as a user journey. Given auctioneer creates a sale and five items are added to the sale, when auctioneer starts the sale, an auctioneer sets a starting bid of 5,000 and buyer one bids and buyer two bids, then auctioneer sells the item and buyer two wins the item. This is a specific business functionality and various different the items in bold, the words in bold, auctioneer, 5, 5,000, buyer 1, buyer 2. These are keywords in that sense to indicate what is the persona, what is the action you're doing. As a result, what happens is we know who is doing the action, what is the business functionality, because you're now talking about exact domain terminology. I'm not saying create an auction when the domain functionality is create a sale, for example. I'm not saying when a user one starts a sale. No, user one could be anything. It's an auctioneer, it's a buyer, it's a seller, whatever happens, right? You use a specific domain terminology to make sure everyone understands what is expected out of that system. The other thing is the actions and verifications happen implicitly. Typically, test cases, the way we write is data setup, do a action, verify the action has completed well. In this case, we are going various levels above that particular logic about that thought process, and we are saying data setup is also a business rule. Auctioneer creating a sale, it's data setup. Five items adding to the sale is data setup. These are also data setup is also implemented in form of business rules. No one can just create a sale in any form. How many items to be added? So you do the action and verify that the action has been done, whether it's data setup or next set of actions, auction is starting the sale or bidding happening. The action and the verification of it being completed is happening at the same time. Last important bit is that this depicts a complete user flow, a user journey, a user scenario. It tells you from the top layer perspective how do you start interacting with the product, who are the different personas who start interacting with it, and how does it get to the end state. It is not a very specific functionality. I have changed a drop down to a checkbox. It is about how to take that product end to end in terms of usability. So for this particular auction product, what we had is at the end of 1 year, we had the test running on Hudson and Jenkins. In fact, the first test that we had was to log in order to create a sale. As soon as we wrote that login test, we put it up on Hudson. So our infrastructure got stabilized and set up in the with the very first test itself. We use Cucumber Ruby stack for implementation of automation. And with Cucumber, we had 33 feature files and 65 scenarios. At the end of a year, the smoke test executed in 15 minutes, regression tests executed completely in 45 minutes. Our manual as well as automated test case repository was Cucumber features itself. And our test cases were only user journeys. We did not write test cases really because we did not see any value in documenting the test cases. The project management tool that we used was Mingle. So we approached this so well. We had such tight collaboration with all different roles on the team. As a result, what happened is we had zero manual tests for regression by the end of the journey. It started off as manual, but when we implemented it, it was automatically in the same repository. We didn't have to do any change. But that worked very well. So no manual regression. Any check-in that happens by the devs, product gets built automatically. We deploy it to an environment. Automatically the test would run. In 15 minutes, we know if the smoke tests are running fine. In 45 minutes, we know if the regression tests are running fine. And these are end-to-end functional user journey based regressions. Now, before we get into the next step, I just quickly want to see any questions. Okay, no questions yet. So, a few words of caution. Context is very, very important. Why did this work for us and why it may not work for you? Or why did it work for me in this particular auction based product and why it will not work for me in the next project that I'm working on? It depends on the context. Context is based on the domain you're working in. It is based on the product under test, how testable it is, how distributed your teams are, what is the skill set of the team that you're working with, what is the capability of the team members that you're working with. Based on these factors, you would come up with a tech stack to say, how do I want to document my test cases or user journeys? How do I want to automate it? What is the process do I want to follow for doing this? And at the same time, what are the tools that I want to use to make this a success? So think about various different factors before saying if this is going to be the right thing for you or not. And based on that, you decide on the approach and the way of testing. Next, BDT is, remember, it's a way of thinking. Using this technique, you can identify the test scenarios or the user journeys, and then you can automate it using any BDT tool and corresponding programming languages, or you can directly start after identifying those mind maps or user journeys, you can start implementing it directly in any programming language also. As with any tool or any additional tool or technology stack you introduce in the framework, it is going to be additional overhead, it is going to be additional maintenance, it is going to be additional effort required for it. With all this, cost goes up. So think carefully about, do you really need to use BDD tool? As long as you know what are the user journeys that you need to automate, you can directly start writing it in implementing this in JUnit or TestNG based framework and implement it, or C sharp NUnit based framework and implement it. So you don't really need to use any BDD tool to use the BDT technique. This is the most important thing, that BDT will not work in isolation. It has to be a teamwork, and the team includes all testers across different locations and teams that you're working with. It includes the developers, BAs, product owners, everyone to really come together to say what is the approach that we want for testing for this product. Because remember, testing is a team responsibility. Testing is not only the testing team responsibility. Gone are the days when testers were the gatekeepers of quality. Now testers are not the gatekeepers. In fact, testers start right from the initial days of the product development and requirement gathering for that matter. So it has to be a very tight team effort. And another point that you need to keep in mind is BDT will work, as I said, as a regression test candidate. You still need to have a lot of very focused and dedicated manual and exploratory testing effort on your product under test, because only after thoroughly testing the product you will really come to know which are the areas which are flaky in the test in the product. What is it that you should be automating more of or less of based on the history of that product. So it is very important to do that manual and exploratory testing very thoroughly. And last but most important bit, now that we are saying that the user journeys that we have identified, only that will be automated from a functional testing perspective as your regression suite. This means that the lower layers of the test pyramid really need to be implemented well. There might be a lot of tests that you think from your exploratory or manual testing, you think it is very important for these to be automated. Yes, it should be, but not necessarily in your UI tests. It can be maybe you can speak to the developers and say, hey guys, this is a scenario that we found which was very critical, but it doesn't make sense for us to automate at the functional layer. Can you make sure you add a lot of unit tests or component tests or whatever other form of test, view tests for that matter, in your layers, specific layers, so that you get the feedback much more quickly. And from a functional testing perspective, you still focus on the breadth of the coverage instead of the granular coverage of that particular product. So this is by far the most important thing that you need to keep in mind from the test pyramid implementation perspective. And this is the part where teams typically lose out on their implementation of the test pyramid. You understand there are various different layers, but then each layer really becomes a silo. No, with silos your test pyramid is not going to work well. It will end up becoming various different test pyramids for that matter. You need to work together as a team to really say what is the best candidate for this test, or which layer is the best candidate for this test to be automated in. Is it unit test, component integration, web service, functional, or whatever else, and accordingly get it automated. That said, what does BDT really do for you? It helps you identify the right type of regression tests. And these regression tests, from my perspective, is where you start classifying it in various different forms of suites to say, if these are my smoke set of user journeys, if this fails, there's no point proceeding with other user journeys. Oh, these are my sanity user journeys, these are my true regression user journeys of sort. You can start classifying them in various different forms once you've identified these layers, these user journeys correctly. The other set of advantages that this brings to us is it incrementally allows us to build the user flows. I spoke about the mind map, how you create it, and you keep on updating that mind map based on what new functionalities and new features are implemented in your product. If you keep on updating the existing mind maps and correspondingly your existing user journeys, you keep on evolving those much more better. You are now actually regressing the required product business value instead of regressing your test cases. Regressing test cases is not adding value to anyone. Regressing product business value, which was working earlier and is still continuing to work fine, is very, very important to the team. If you get these automated, then the tests are always going to be in sync with the product functionality. Because if the product functionality changes, the test is going to fail. You immediately update the test, or if it was an unexpected change, you found a defect in that case. But if the tests need to be updated, you update it, and now your tests are in sync with the new product functionality. As a result, these become very effective tests. You know exactly what is the value you are delivering to the business by these tests. Also, if you specify it in the business terminology, you're removing implementation details and you're removing the ambiguity from all the roles involved by speaking what exactly is the business value you're bringing to the table by these particular tests. Everyone can relate to it again. it becomes easy to understand the new functionality also, because now you're not saying I have changed my checkbox to a drop down or drop down to a checkbox. You're talking about why it is important to make those changes. And again, that becomes easier in understanding, because right now I may know why that functionality is being changed, but after 2 months, if I look back on this test and say, why do I have a test which is checking if this is a drop down or not? It doesn't make sense at all. These form of tests will help you understand the new functionality better. If you specify it in a simple common language, this is more of if you use it in a BDD, or if you have a BDD layer on top to specify these tests, they become living documentation. So there is one form of product documentation how it is to be used. The second form is your test as form of executable specifications to say this is my user journeys, and that is a documentation because now I know exactly what this product is supposed to be doing in form of the test. Also added advantage is that it becomes a form of a great asset for onboarding. As new team members come on, they know just by reading the test, they know what is going on. Even if it's not in the BDD language, they look at the test in Java or C Sharp or Python, Ruby, wherever. They look at the test and they're talking about the domain functionality, the business functionality that you're implementing, not the granular functionality, and to know exactly why certain rules happen in a particular sequence. As a result, it makes the testers happy, it makes the team happy, because now you know what is being tested, and you have removed the ambiguity, and you're getting the same visibility for everyone, which was the goal that we set out with initially. The other big problem that BDT solves is taking executable specifications, or actually implementing giving a technique to implement executable specifications. So how did a product come into being? Someone or some set of people had a business idea what they want to do with a particular product. That business idea got broken down into features, which got broken down into epics to make it more manageable. Epics became stories. Stories are implemented in various iterations. Various iterations form releases, and multiple releases eventually realize the business value for the product owners, for the business owners for that matter. This is agile terminology, but can very easily be mapped to various different methodologies also. Now, what BDT does is it helps us focus on the output of functionality from iterations and releases in form of business functionality. Whatever functionality is developed collectively in iterations and releases is being mapped by the BDT scenarios, which when automated become your executable specifications. Your executable specifications, when they run in for continuous integration or manually execute those, you are ensuring that the business idea is still validated at the end. The test pyramid is going to the lower layers of the test pyramid are going to cover automation at the story level, at the iteration level also for that matter. But your BDT scenarios are validating your business ideas on a continuous basis. Okay. Some of the tools that you can use to enable BDT, I spoke about some tools which really helped a lot is whiteboards. Mind maps can be used, especially if you are working distributed. Mind maps make it easier. Also, you can change things much more easier than whiteboards. You can use flow charting tools. Essentially, anything that you can use to map your personas to your expected business functionality and get it implemented, get it identified, and automated accordingly. With that, I come to an end of this particular session. This was the content I had to speak about. I am open for questions. You can put them in chat, or you can now unmute yourself, and I'm going to unmute everyone for that matter. And looking forward for questions.
आपके छोटे हथियार और एयरक्राफ्ट से ये लोग वो जो वायदा है उसका नाम भी बता दें strategic deployment इसका नाम रखा गया है। क्या समझते हैं आप क्या होगा इस्लामी नजरियाती कौंसिल ये कायम रहेगी? मेरे नहीं ख्याल इसके
Any question, folks? So there were some questions or comments initially before we started the session. Does this answer most of those questions? So, no, we have a few questions now. Aparna is asking, how do we approach testing a user journey when features are being partially completed in sprints? Great question. So, as I said initially, let's say the first, I'm going to use Agile as an example, the Agile methodology as an example. Iteration zero, when all we are doing is first coming up with a bare bone homepage with some login credential, for example, right? Just username, password, login. Maybe there is no validation also that happens, but it's a bare bone page. So my user journey at this point in time is okay, I should be able to log in, or user A should be able to log in with password B. That is my user journey. Next iteration, I'm going to add many more validations or many more functionalities on top of it, and my mind map starts getting complex. So the first few iterations for an Azure, it is going to be very difficult to think about the functionality as a user journey. You're still trying to put things, you're trying to place the pieces of the puzzle before the whole puzzle can be solved. So you have to take it in increments. And that's why it is very important to keep on going back to your drawing board to make sure you keep on consolidating what you have identified earlier. Otherwise, you'll end up with a test hole. In Agile, one example that I always like to give is if, for example, there are 10 stories being implemented in each iteration, and in each story, there are 10 test cases that you have. So in iteration 1, you would end up with 100 test cases, which you have tested. In iteration 2, you get a new 10 stories with new test cases for each. And now you've got 100 test cases for iteration 2. What are you going to regress from the earlier functionality? You cannot be saying, I've done that earlier, I don't need to test it again. But now, immediately what it says is, I've got 200 tests to test. Next iteration, I've got 300 tests to regress completely, or rather 200 regression and 100 for that iteration. How can you make it manageable? First iteration is fine. Second iteration, you say, okay, which 50 out of those 100 is important for me to test again? And this technique helps in doing that. So, Aparna, you would start off with identifying the personas, identifying the functionality in bits and pieces, what is possible, and keep on evolving your user journey. I think a mind map is a great way of doing that. You just start using it and keep it as a reference based on which you derive your user journeys out of it. But this mind map, a state diagram, will help tremendously in achieving that. Also be very careful not to confuse the mind map, what you put on the mind map, with actual user actions, but think about it from a business implementation perspective. Successful login is a business rule that goes on the mind map, but select a certain item from a drop down, that is not a mind map item. I hope that helps. um, Another question: what does your test pyramid look like in terms of number of tests in the UI unit integration? It really depends on the product under test, what the pyramid should look like. Me putting in any numbers doesn't mean it's going to be valid for you, or that ratio split is going to be valid for you. But in my example, what I showed, we had 65 scenarios at the top layer. That was a full regression suite, and that was completely automated. Those 65 scenarios were broken into smoke, sanity, and various other functionalities or further categorizations. That was our top layer. The JavaScript testing, and sorry, the 65 also included web service testing. The lower layers, unit or other component integration, component and unit tests, they were much more in number, and the unit tests, for that matter, were in the thousands in number. So it was a very good test pyramid implementation, and I was fortunate to be part of that implementation from start to the finish. But remember it, in some cases maybe having 500 functional at the top layer is the right thing, and having 500 functional and maybe 5000 unit test might be a good ratio. It really depends on the context of the product under test. Next question, does it make sense to use BDT for data driven testing? It does not really matter. BDT, as I said, is an approach to testing. Data driven testing is more of specific scenarios that you want to drive for that same scenario, or rather different data for that scenario. So once you've identified the scenario, if it makes sense to pass in various different forms of data to implement that test, by all means, why not? Data driven testing is a great way of doing that. Again, it's a context of what is the test that you need to automate, and then automating that, thinking about is that the right test to automate, is very important. Guys, if there's follow up to these questions, please put in your questions on the chat as I proceed to the next ones. Nidhi is saying, I've been in a situation where I decided to automate 7 out of 10 possible test flows, but we ended up having a regression defect in the 3 flows that I skipped. How do I create a test suite capturing all combination of test flows, keeping the size of regression suite manageable? Nidhi, this is exactly the situation where I said where tight collaboration and implementation of the test pyramid is important. As a test team, you cannot use BDT technique alone if the developer team is not going to be collaborating with you and testers collaborating with the developers. For you to say out of to be confident that 7 out of the 10 test flows have been automated and 3 can be skipped, you can only say 3 can be skipped if they have been automated in some form in the lower layers of the pyramid. For that, you say, you talk to the developers and say, I'm not automating these 3 flows, maybe because it is very data intensive and it takes a long time for test data setup, and it takes a long time to execute this test. It is rather better you do JavaScript automation for it, or do unit test automation for it. It will be faster feedback for the team, and if you're able to convince the devs to write that, then that is how you prevent the regressions from happening. It is not about not automating all the tests. You have to automate each and every test possible. Which layer you automate it as, that is important to be seen, and that is important to convince other roles in the team to say why it is good to be done and what value it brings to the team as a result. Do you split your regression tests into separate jobs on CI? How do you recommend doing so? Again, it depends on the context of the product under test. For my auction product, we had various different forms of a test automated in form of user journeys. We split it up as admin smoke, admin regression, because that was nothing really to do with the actual auction executing. It was more of setting up the auction. So we split up the functionality in terms of, okay, this is admin related, this is auction related or sale related. For auction, we've got just smoke and regression is sufficient. For auction, we have smoke, we have sanity, we have regression. We also had a separate type of test to do concurrency, to test concurrent behaviors in high load. What happens? We had a stress test which was automated and put on CI. So really depending on the context of the test product under test, what are the different functionalities, what are the different features, what are the different personas. You want to split it up accordingly, and then execute these tests in parallel. For that matter, certain tests will happen in sequence. So for example, if my smoke passes, only then I can execute my other tests in parallel. If my smoke itself fails, there is no point in me doing anything else. So that's how you would organize your CI also. Any set of guidelines on the ideal level of steps defined in a feature file. I don't think there's anything like a guideline I can mention. Now, there is a risk of thinking about user journeys of getting all different functionalities and combinations in a scenario. That's a risk. But again, that is something that the team needs to be conscious of saying that if this is a functionality, these are the personas for that functionality, or the functionality that uses these personas. What is the specific user journeys out of this? So from a mind map, it can get very complicated and it can get quite wide. From that wide mind map, you think about various different scenarios and say, this is a good partial user journey, which if done correctly is a good validation itself. So I don't need to go from right from start opening a browser right till the end of the sale completing. But I'm saying I started it, set up the sale, I sold one vehicle, my test is complete. So it really depends on what is it that you're trying to achieve, what is it you're trying to validate, and using declarative way of specifying these journeys helps a lot in keeping it concise at that common domain level terminology. Shobhit, hope that helps in some way. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Did I miss any question? Any feedback? Is this something? Is this technique something that you're already using on your teams? Or is this something that you realize is a different, truly a different way of approaching your regression testing?
Anand, I think this session was really helpful. We have had so many sessions in our meetups, but we haven't had something related to BDD. So I think the group would be helped a lot through this. So thank you very much for doing this for us.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mona, for setting it up. I would really appreciate feedback, good, bad, ugly. I'll take it in a very positive way. Always looking for ways to
Sure.
do better.
So we would be sharing the slides, and Anand has done the recording of the session as well. So we'll be posting on the meetup site, and Anand has provided his information. So if people want to reach out to him future, he'll be more than happy to do so. So
Awesome.
if there aren't any final questions, then we'll close this webinar today. I think we are good. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Anand, for doing this talk, and everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much, and see you around, guys, in our next meetup.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward now to connecting with you individually as well. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.